Prejudice can be a problem in whatever form it takes. You can be prejudiced against somebody because of the color of a person's skin. You can be prejudiced against somebody because of the language that they speak. You can be prejudiced against somebody because of what they look like, or sometimes their particular, let's say, hygiene habits, because of where they're from. There is literally an endless list of things that people can be prejudiced against others for. Prejudice didn't start here in the United States. In fact, prejudice has been around since near the beginning of the Old Testament. So you can pretty well say it's been around for all of history. Unfortunately, it doesn't go in peaks and valleys or go away anytime. Unfortunately, even the first century church had to deal with the problem of prejudice. It seems Peter, on one occasion, was being a bit prejudiced and was leading others down the same dark path into a very deadly trap. Paul arrives just in the nick of time, though, and in Galatians 2:11 through 21, Paul records for us the events which transpired when he confronted Peter. And you might say it was a main event caliber confrontation. We had Peter on one side and Paul on the other, and you get the tail of the tape, and you could get Michael Buffer in here to do his "let's get ready to rumble." No, not really, you couldn't. Because they were grown-ups about it, and they were adults about it, and they were Christians about it. Well, let's see what happened in Galatians chapter 2, verses 11 through 21. But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles. But when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. And the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with him, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas before them all, "If you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you force the Gentiles to live like Jews? We ourselves are Jews by birth, and not Gentile sinners. Yet we know that a person is not justified by works of the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ. So we also have believed in Christ Jesus in order to be justified by faith in Christ and not by works of the law, because by works of the law no one will be justified. But if, in our endeavor to be justified in Christ, we too were found to be sinners, is Christ then a servant of sin? Certainly not. For if I rebuild what I tore down, I prove myself to be a transgressor. For through the law I died to the law so that I might live to God. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. I do not nullify the grace of God, for if righteousness were through the law, then Christ died for no purpose. Let's begin this evening by looking at Paul's rebuke of Peter. 3 bits of background that I want to share with you concerning Paul's rebuke. And we start with the situation's background. See, early critics of Christianity, people such as Celsus and Porphyry and others, excuse me, these early critics of Christianity used this incident to attack the Christian faith itself. They criticized the character of both Paul and Peter for their quote-unquote shameful quarreling. They used it to say, if being a Christian means you're going to argue over all these little things and get into these silly little spats. And critics of Christianity will say that. Jerome, an early church historian, saw it as a staged event, that Peter and Paul had gotten together And they talked about this, and they had come up with a little script that they followed as they went through it and everything in order to bring the issue out into the open, and so better condemn the Judaizers, or more effectively condemn the Judaizers. Augustine, on the other hand, he believed that it was a situation of the higher claims of truth over rank and office. Now, what means is, he says it's a case of Peter's error despite his primacy, and Paul's rightful rebuke and defense of the gospel, and Peter's humility in accepting correction from an inferior in both age and standing. If you can't tell, Augustine was a Catholic. He believed Peter to be the first pope of the church, the first earthly head of the church. And that's what he means by, despite Peter's primacy, Paul, an inferior in rank and age and standing, was able to rebuke him. Well, you know good and well that nobody can rebuke the Pope. And it always has been that way, and that the Pope is infallible, according to the Catholic Church. And so the idea that it was truth over rank and office, it's hard to accept if you don't accept the fact that Peter was the first Pope, because he was not. Anyway, so if it wasn't shameful quarreling, and it wasn't a staged event, and it wasn't truth over rank and office, what was it? Well, I believe it was a case where Peter got cold feet. And because of his position, not his position as the Pope, but because of his position as a Jerusalem apostle, because of his position as an elder in the Jerusalem church, like 1 Peter 5 tells us he was. Because of his position in that regard, his cold feet were contagious. And Paul had to step in and say, hey, Peter, let me remind you of something that happened back when you were in Joppa, staying at the home of Simon the tanner, and the sheet came down from heaven. You remember that, Peter? Acts chapter 10 tells us about that story. So that tells us a little bit about the situation's background. Well, now let's turn our attention to the city's background. The city's background. No city, except for Jerusalem in the Roman Empire, played a larger part in the life of the early church as Antioch of Syria. Antioch was important to the early church. It was a very important place. But more than just to the church, one thing you may not know about Antioch was that it was a hotbed for various groups, religious and otherwise. Philosophies, cults, religions. The city prided itself on its high level of quote-unquote tolerance. They were the tolerant people, and they would put up with just about anything, they would say. And because of this tolerance, there were a great number of people in that city that accepted the gospel and committed themselves to Christ even before Paul made it his base of operation. These people had to separate themselves from the other religions that were in the city, that had taken hold in the city and that people were professing in the city. And so the city's population nicknamed these people Christians, which literally means Christ followers or people of Christ. Since the name was deemed appropriate, the disciples were called Christians first at Antioch. Acts 11:26 tells us. So we've looked at the situation's background, we've seen the city's background. Now let's turn our attention to one more piece of background information, some background information concerning the problem, the problem's background. And it would appear that there are two main players in the problem. The first would be Peter. Peter's part actually has to do, well, it started with Peter's conduct before the delegation from James came to him. Verse 12 in the Greek is in the imperfect tense. Now, there's no real imperfect tense in English, so it kind of makes it difficult to translate, but the imperfect tense in verse 12 suggests that Peter ate with the Gentile believers regularly and often, and not just once or twice, but it was a habit of his. It was his custom, we might say, to eat with the Gentile believers. This is consistent with his vision on the rooftop of Simon the tanner in Joppa, as we discussed in Acts chapter 10. It is of much debate as to what to eat means in this particular context. Does it mean a regular meal, or is it talking about the Lord's Supper? The word implies a fellowship sort of meal. Ironically, the same word is used as part of the charge against Peter in Acts chapter 11, verse 3, when they find out about him going into the house of Cornelius, and they say, "You ate with uncircumcised men." The bottom line is that before this delegation came from James, Peter was not discriminating. He was not acting prejudicially toward the Gentiles. I'm sure that he ate both regular meals and partook of the Lord's Supper with the Gentiles. And it wasn't a big deal to him. That is, until certain men came from James. After they came, Peter's conduct somewhat changed. He began to withdraw from the Gentiles. Now, why does he do that? Well, because it says here, Peter was afraid of the circumcision group. Now, who are the circumcision group? Well, people who study these things tell us there are four options. They were the Jewish Christians who held a particular partisan or prejudiced view of circumcision. For example, the Judaizers, the same people that Paul has to battle their influence in Galatia, here in the book of Galatians. Maybe it was Jewish Christians who held a nonpartisan view of circumcision. Or it could have been Gentile Christians who had adopted the Jewish lifestyle, either in whole or in part. In other words, there were some excuse me. In other words, there were some Gentiles who had already submitted to circumcision and kind of felt, well, you know what, if I had to do it, then now they have to do it, sort of thing. Or it could have been non-Christian Jews that Peter was afraid of. The answer we really don't know for sure, but from Paul's other uses of the word circumcision party, we can assume that it was probably the zealot-minded Jews and the trouble they could stir up in Jerusalem if word leaked out that one of the quote-unquote pillars of the church was actually fellowshipping with Gentiles. So in other words, Peter is put under pressure. And as we know from our study of the Gospels, Peter is not real good under pressure, is he? Let me give you a couple for instances. For instance, when he was walking on the water to Jesus, and something happened and he took his eyes off of Jesus. The pressure was on, he took his eyes off of Jesus and he began to sink. Or, excuse me, in the Garden of Gethsemane, when he said, "I will never desert you," just a few hours earlier. And he deserted Jesus. And then, well, he didn't totally desert him. He followed him along the way up to the trial of Jesus. But when he was there, guess what? He denied Jesus 3 times. 3 times he said, "I don't know the man." So Peter, he's constantly putting his foot in his mouth. He's not real good under pressure, we might say. The picture Paul paints in verse 12 is of a man who made a misguided tactical error under pressure, or a misguided tactical maneuver under pressure. I have no doubt that Peter had the right convictions, but he became confused maybe under pressure, and so he found himself retreating from what he knew to be right. See, the problem is, when the pressure's on, that's when we need to be at the top of our game. See, that's why when you're playing basketball or coaching basketball, you make your team shoot free throw after free throw after free throw after free throw in practice. It's a 15-foot shot with nobody in your way. What's so hard about that? Well, it's not that difficult until there's pressure on. And so you shoot free throw after free throw after free throw so that when the pressure's on at the end of the game, it's muscle memory, and you just do it without even thinking about the pressure or what it is that's happening. Peter also is influential. Why did the others follow Peter's lead? Did they really believe the delegation? Did they believe that the Gentiles were not worthy of fellowship? Or were they only following the lead of an apostle and leader, Peter? Because remember, Peter was the first one to go into the house of Gentiles and fellowship with them. And maybe Peter found out that that wasn't what God wanted him to do. And so he stopped doing it, and so they followed him. In all likelihood, that's the most accurate explanation. They had been in the practice of eating and fellowshipping with the Gentiles, largely because of Peter's defense of it. So when he stopped doing it, they stopped doing it. That was Peter's part of the problem. However, Paul's part comes up a little bit later on. Particularly painful to Paul personally. Say that 5 times fast. Particularly painful to Paul personally was that Barnabas was led astray by Peter's hypocrisy. The word for led astray often appears with a voice of irrationality. So it may have been an irrational emotion that caused Barnabas to go astray. In fact, if you look at the entire phrase, so that by their hypocrisy even Barnabas was led astray, it points to the fact that Paul credited or discredited or blamed even Peter and the other Jewish believers with leading Barnabas away from the truth. But at the same time, Paul knew that Barnabas was also at fault. We cannot blame anyone but ourselves when we mess up. When we mess up, it is not our wife's fault. It is not our husband's fault. It is not our kids' fault. It is not our parents' fault. It is not our friends' fault. It is not our grandparents' fault. It's not even Satan's fault. Okay, yes, he may have put that temptation in our way, but we are the ones who yielded to it. We are the ones who made the choice to follow that temptation and to give in to that temptation. It's nobody's fault but our own. So while he credits or discredits, whatever we want to say, Peter and the other Jews with leading Barnabas astray, still Barnabas bears responsibility for his actions and his choices. If you've ever been let down by someone who you looked up to, then you know how Paul felt about Barnabas's participation in this hypocrisy. You know, in 1991, millions of basketball fans around the world were let down when their hero, Irvin Magic Johnson, announced that he was retiring from basketball because he was HIV positive. Crushed they were. Well, Paul's Magic Barnabas, the one who took up for him when nobody else would, when nobody else trusted him, Acts chapter 9, verse 27. The one who brought him to Antioch for the first time, Acts 11, 25 and 26. The one who accompanied Paul on his first missionary journey, which included going into Galatia, Acts chapters 13 and 14. Barnabas, who was clearly in favor of reaching out to the Gentiles, had let him down. And so Paul makes an evaluation of the situation. There's evidence from the Greek language that this was a gradual withdrawal from the Gentiles. So it begs to ask, why didn't Paul say something sooner? Why did he let it get to this point where even Mr. Encouragement Barnabas was led astray? Well, some people say, well, was Paul himself misled for a time? Or maybe Paul was unclear as to the implications that were involved, i.e. that there could not be any real fellowship between the Jews and the Gentiles, and that became Christians without Gentiles observing the law of the Jews. Was Paul not able, unwilling, or for whatever reason, not able to speak freely? I don't think it was any of these things. Because if it was, then Paul has no right to be so rebuking in his rebuke of Peter. He has no right to speak so harshly, if you will, and to use such sharp words when rebuking Peter. What I think happened, okay, and this is my thoughts only, okay, I don't have any scriptures that can back this up or anything. My thought is that Paul was out of town. Maybe he was there, Peter got there, had some other Jews with him, and Paul said, okay, well, Peter's here, so I'm going to go home to Tarsus or wherever, go see family. You know, for whatever reason, he had left Antioch. And Peter was there, and everything was good when Paul left. And then Paul came back, and he finds this situation where the Jews from James had come, and the bad things were happening, and the things that that they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel. The phrase "in step with" or "in line with" in verse 14 is a translation of the word that we get our English word orthopedics from. Now, it means to walk straight or upright as opposed to limping. In context, it denotes upright, unwavering, sincere conduct as opposed to hypocritical wavering, the hypocritical wavering course followed by Peter and the Jewish believers at Antioch and even Barnabas. There was a serious problem with the way what they were doing. Now, for an athlete, or really for anybody, having orthopedic surgery is oftentimes the last resort. It is not something that anybody wants to have to go through. It's a drastic response. And sometimes it takes a drastic response. Drastic measures are necessary sometimes in order to correct the problem. For any lasting solution to a problem, though, you have to get to the root of the problem. Paul is disappointed at the Antioch believers. He's crushed by Barnabas' decision to participate in this hypocrisy. But his problem was with Peter. So Paul takes the drastic measure and confronts Peter to his face and in public. And Paul's point that he makes, understand, he doesn't assume that in a few years Peter's going to straighten himself out. Doesn't figure that out. He doesn't decide, okay, you know how I'm going to fight this? I'm going to start rumors about Peter. I'm going to talk bad about Peter behind his back and see if whispering will get Peter to be quiet and to go back to Jerusalem so that I can fix the problem after he's gone. He doesn't go down the street and start his own congregation. He doesn't find somewhere else to go because he wants to influence them in the right way and in the truth and everything. He does what a mature Christian should do. He confronts Peter to his face, verse 11, and he confronts Peter in public, verse 14. Wait a second, preacher. What do you mean he did what a Christian should do? Jesus, in Matthew 18, verse 15 and following, says, if you have a problem with someone, you go and talk to them in private first. If they don't listen to you, then you take a couple of witnesses, and that as a last resort is when you do it in public. That's true. That's what Jesus said. And won't Paul himself say a little bit later on in this very book, in Galatians chapter 6, verse 1, that if someone is caught in a sin, we who are spiritual should restore them gently. So where's the patience? Where's the gentleness? Well, we need to understand that Jesus and later Paul in Galatians are talking about a different matter. This is not a personal matter. You know, this is is not a case of something that is incidental or secondary. It's not a minor difference of opinion. Okay, this is a case where Paul has a serious issue with something that Peter is publicly teaching and professing. Paul views Peter's actions as a direct threat to the truth of the gospel. It is a public problem and therefore had to be dealt with publicly. And in fact, Paul will write in 1 Timothy 5 verse 20, an elder who sins is to be rebuked publicly or corrected publicly. Peter was an elder in the Jerusalem church, but he was an elder. Paul knows, and Peter knows, that justification is no longer based on race. That grace is what matters now, and grace is for men of all nationalities. Paul's point is clear. Just as he was able to withstand the pressures of the false brothers in Jerusalem, Peter should have been able to withstand the pressure of the false brothers from Jerusalem, of the delegation from James. So that's the heart of Paul's rebuke. We now come to Paul's remarks, what he says to Peter. And he has 3 points, like any good sermon does. Now, I know you're looking at your sermon notes and saying, wait, this only has 2. You're right. Okay. At least, 3, 2, 4, whatever. Okay, anyway. His first remarks concern a Christian's liberty. In verse 17, he asks a rhetorical question. The question is, does our freedom encourage us to sin? It's very similar to the rhetorical question he asked in Romans 6 verse 1. What shall we say then? Shall we go on sinning so that grace may increase? In each case, the answer might be literally translated, may it not be. But this really only translates the words from the Greek language, not the emotion of the statement. With the emotion, we might say, certainly not, or absolutely not. If you can ever find a copy of what's called the Cotton Patch version of the Bible, I've never actually seen it, but my Greek teacher in college told me this and told the class this, so everything else he said was pretty much accurate, so we'll go with it. But the Cotton Patch version of the Bible translates it actually in a way that is inappropriate for me to tell you in the context of, life, because it involves some words that used in a way that we are probably not supposed to use them. But that gets the emotion of it. Think of the absolute strongest possible way for you to say for you to say no. And that's the emotion of what Paul is saying here. He is saying absolutely not. God forbid, perhaps, would be a way of putting it. Our freedom is not a license to sin. It does not allow us to do as we please. It is freedom from the law of Moses. But if a Christian chooses to return to the law, then he becomes a lawbreaker. See, the purpose of the law was to point beyond itself to a fuller relationship with God. The purpose of Christ's death was to free us from the old law and place us under a new law, a law of grace. Now, instead of focusing on the law, a means to the end, we can focus on Christ, who is the end. So if we try to return to the law, as the Judaizers wanted the Galatians to do, and as Peter, Barnabas, and the others were doing, we are guilty of breaking the very law that we are trying to follow. So he talks first about a Christian's liberty. Next he talks about a Christian's death. The perfect tense in verse 20, it's another one of those tenses that's kind of difficult to get across in the English, looks at a past event whose effects are still ongoing in the present. In other words, when he says, I've been crucified with Christ, the perfect tense means you could translate it, I have been and still am crucified with Christ. That's a little bit wordy, don't you think? But that's the idea behind it. I have been and still am crucified with Christ. It happened, and its effects are still in place even today. See, the cross to Jesus was a means of death. He had to make a conscious choice to die. Likewise, when we crucify ourselves, It's a conscious choice that we make to say no to the things that we like, to say no to the things that we, in some cases, even hold dear. We make a conscious choice and decision to die to ourselves. The cross to Jesus meant death. The cross was not, to Jesus, the cross was not, it was not a piece of gold or silver jewelry that he wore around his neck. Now, I'm not knocking wearing a cross as jewelry. That's not my point. It's not my purpose. Unless that's the only cross that you choose to bear. Even some popular entertainers wear a cross as part of their costume, but that's all it is to them, is part of their costume. How can I say that? You look at the way they lead their lives, and you know that they don't take it seriously, that they aren't truly following Christ, that they haven't truly taken up their cross and followed Jesus. And if you want to wear a cross as decoration, that's fine. But just make sure that it's not the only cross that you bear. And before and after this, before Paul had a law-centered life, after Paul is leading a Christ-centered life. Before he died this death, Paul lived only for himself. After he died this death, Paul lives for others. So a Christian's liberty, a Christian's death, and finally, a Christian's gift. Paul's question to Peter is pretty simple. How are you going to get to heaven? You can't get to heaven by observing the law, or only fellowshipping with people of the same race as you, or the same language as you, or the same this, that, the other, who are just like you. If salvation could be earned through following the law, then Jesus died for nothing. In the 1980s, it was a very popular slogan to say, I'm okay, you're okay. And in the 1980s, I had a t-shirt. It had an image of Jesus on the cross. And down below it, it said, if I'm okay and you're okay, explain this. Because if I'm okay and you're okay, then Jesus didn't have to die. But I'm not okay. And you're not okay. And so Jesus did have to die for us. The grace of God demonstrated by Jesus dying on the cross is for all nations. It is for all races. It is for all people. It is our only ticket to righteousness, and thus it is our only ticket to heaven. Friends, prejudice has absolutely no place in the church that Jesus died for. It doesn't. In the book of Acts, Luke records Peter as saying in Acts 10:34 and 35, then Peter began to speak. I now realize how true it is that God does not show favoritism, but accepts men from every nation who fear Him and do what is right. Brothers and sisters, prejudice in any context has no place in the body that Jesus sacrificed His life for. That's what Paul is telling Peter about Peter's withdrawing from the Gentiles because of peer pressure to act that certain way. Saying, don't do it. Peter was being hypocritical in his treatment of the Gentiles simply because they were Gentiles, which is translated as prejudice, which is further translated as clearly in the wrong. Later in the book of Galatians, Paul says in Galatians 3:28, there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Now, there are some people who take that verse to say something that it doesn't say. And we'll talk about that when we get to Galatians chapter 3, verse 28. But what he's really saying is that everybody comes to Christ, everybody comes to God on equal footing. When we are baptized into Christ, we all become the exact same color to God. Because God doesn't look at the outside, He looks at what's on the inside. As Christians, we have to start looking past the outward appearance and start seeing people as God does. We need to stop looking at people based on what their nationality is, based on what their language is. We need to see them as souls. Souls that are going to spend eternity in one of two places. And we should see it as our job to reach out to them to make sure that they have the opportunity to spend eternity in heaven with God. Is that your destination? If not, then we want to help. Maybe what you need is simply a private response where you're at. Maybe what you need to do is publicly respond, asking for the prayers of the church. Maybe you've never made Jesus the Lord of your life by being immersed in the watery grave of baptism for the forgiveness of your sins. If so, there's no reason for you to leave here still in need, still separated from Christ. You can bring Him your broken life, and He'll make it whole again, but only if you give it all to Him. If we can help you in some way to do that, won't you come to the front now as we stand and sing together?